So we now turn to property in Portugal. We start with Luis da Silva of Portugal Senior Living, who will take you through the property market in Portugal, the areas that are most popular, and then we will be followed by Edwina Shrimpton-Daluz, who will talk to you about the process for buying in Portugal and how it differs from the process in the UK. First of all, Luis, over to you, Luis.
Thanks, Nigel, for the invitation to speak. And my section is really to give you a bit of an overview of Portugal as the market and drop down into the real estate component or the accommodation component of the process of moving to, retiring to, or purchasing something or renting something in Portugal, and hopefully that will tie together some of the elements that people before me have spoken about. So the accommodation element as a whole is an important component of the puzzle, as it were, because without it, as you've seen from the various speakers, it is very difficult to move other processes forward. You need to prove that you have effectively an address, a residence in Portugal, in order to accomplish many of the other tasks. And so a lot of this hinges around finding the right sort of accommodation. So I'm going to talk through 3 slides, not on the pictures, but I'm just going to put up 3 slides with pictures and then talk about the context of Portugal, and in particular, what has changed and what has not changed in the last sort of 5 or 6 years. And of course, we are talking during a period where COVID has essentially changed a lot of things in the market. So what has changed in the last few years is the economy prior to COVID, one should say, had experienced very strong levels of growth. And the immediate benefit of that to the country as a whole is that there had been a reduction, effectively, in the in government debt as a percentage of GDP. Clearly, that has now reversed with COVID and the measures that the government has had to take to combat some of the issues. But in effect, that increase in expenditure from the government is something that is happening in all countries across Europe and, in fact, the world. So Portugal is not exempt from that spike in investment and in expenditure, as most countries are not. There's been a recent report by the Canadian government highlighting that Portugal seems to be very much better placed, not only relative to previous crises, but also in terms of the current European context to weather the storm. We shall see whether that is the case or not. In terms of the level of activity in the market, what has happened is that from 2014 to 2018-19, approximately, real estate prices, and this includes rental prices, have increased dramatically. In 2019, we started to see a little bit of tailing off of that, mainly because there had been such dramatic price increases in the years before then. Sales volume was down in the first quarter of 2020, but prices, average prices per sale was actually up. So the price per square meter and the average price paid per property in Portugal in the first quarter of the year, which included a month, shall we say, of COVID, was actually higher than previously. And so I think that should answer the question of anyone who says, are we starting to see deep discounting and whatever? Generally speaking, no. I will talk a little bit about rental values, but generally speaking, Portugal is not reacting in the same way as it did in the 2008-2009 crisis, with deep discounting, and a bit of a crisis in the real estate sector. In certain markets, such as Lisbon, the prices increased in that same period to which I referred by as much as 60 to 100%. And in 2018, I know it's slightly outdated now, but to give you a set of context, Portugal was the 4th highest price increase, registered that higher 4th highest increase in Western Europe at around 10%, versus around 4.2% average. So again, the point I wish to make is that as a real estate market, it is not necessarily the cheapest market anymore. There are still opportunities to be found. But I think the old image of Portugal as a very cheap market is something which we need to I think expunge from our thinking process. Around 200,000 or so houses are sold every year. On the screen in front of you, you'll see some of the landscapes or cityscapes, pictures of Porto, Lisbon, Lagos, Cascais, Portimão, that gives you a sense of the sort of urban context of the Portuguese cities, for those who don't know the country that well. Clearly, it's a country with a lot of appeal in terms of the beach, the golf, and the marina lifestyle, as it were. And it's a multi-award-winning destination, very popular with many different nationalities. We in our business work with around 25, 26 different nationalities of clients. And so I think it proves more than anything else that Portugal does truly have a global appeal. And that appeal has increased tremendously in the last 4 or 5 years. The availability of real estate varies by region. There is a continued lack of supply of new build or modern apartments. And even in emerging areas, as I would call them, such as the Silver Coast or smaller villages in the Algarve, there's already a reflection of the new build premium. So you might find a traditional property that is priced at, let's say, X, 100,000, and a new build property that might be priced at 2 or 3X, 200 to 300,000. And although that's an extreme, perhaps, example, there is a new build premium which has worked its way into the market. There is regulation which has now been implemented by the Portuguese government, in particular with regards to curbing over tourism, and this is in specifically affects the historical regions of the main cities. Lisbon and Porto, in particular, have certain historical areas limited in terms of the rental possibilities, in particular short-term rental possibilities, due to the wish by the Portuguese government to curb an over tourism in those markets, and a sort of decharacterization of exactly the characteristics that attracted people to the region in the first place. So rather than having local people live in places, we now have sort of 90% Airbnbs in some locations, and so the government is attempting to balance that supply and demand element to ensure that the traditional element and the appeal of the country remains. Tourism will suffer and is suffering a huge impact due to coronavirus, just in our business, because we work with rentals and we work with sales and a whole range of other areas. I spent most of my March and bits of April processing client refunds due to events we were running or whatever that were postponed. And I spent most of June and July, again, refunding people who are cancelling trips. A lot of British people who were worried about the quarantine, Irish people who don't have Portugal on the green corridor. So it's been a very turbulent time for the tourist industry in the country, and that has led to some discounting of rental amounts. In terms of the source of demand, that has changed. So the British market, as you probably all know, represented a substantial portion of the inbound tourism from or to Portugal, and that has changed in the last few years, primarily because of the non-habitual residency program. It has brought in many French, Swedes, and other Northern Europeans attracted by the low tax environment, of course, in addition to all the other intrinsic characteristics of the country. But it's meant that areas such as the Algarve or Greater Lisbon, like Cascais, are much more cosmopolitan in feel, rather than having a very British sort of expat feel. It's now quite common to see foreign number plates as people try to get their cars registered, or people speaking different languages. So that's been a change in the last few years, and fortunately so, because Brexit introduced an element of risk and uncertainty into the country, and that slack has been picked up by other by other nationalities, sort of non-British nationalities. And then the exchange rate, clearly the pound has taken a hit historically, but for other nationalities, the dollar, for example, is not far off what it was maybe 5 years ago. So we're not, the euro and dollars have traded blows over the last few years. So those coming from North America, perhaps less of a currency issue versus taking a decision 5 years ago, where from a pound perspective, that's not been the case. What has not changed in the country, and I'm putting now up a slide about sort of explaining different architectural styles, but to let people know that various different things are available: the rustic, the traditional, the contemporary, the more modern, the refurbished. But what has not changed in the country is the fundamentals, or are the fundamentals. So it's still the third safest country in the world. It's the second best country in the world at integrating migrants, and we are all migrants when we migrate to a new country, so it's not intended in the pejorative sense at all. Ease of travel and connectivity is fantastic, even though it lies on the western edge of Europe. It has the 12th best healthcare system in the world, and I think we've heard already a comment about the fact that it mirrors very, very closely the UK national health system. And I unfortunately am a beneficiary of both, because I am recovering from COVID, having suffered some complications from the disease. So I did have to, for the first time in a long time, make the most of the NHS, and I would say that I didn't rank it any higher than I have my sort of family's experiences with the SNS, Sistema Nacional de Saúde in Portugal. If there are any Americans or Canadians on the call, the healthcare can be up to 90% cheaper than in the US. It's the 12th best country in which to bring up a family in the world. It's no longer the world's best kept secret, because the Algarve in particular has been voted the best place in the world to retire, I think, for the last 8 years in a row. It does have the lowest cost of living in Western Europe, with the exception of some items. Housing has now become one of those, and fuel or gas, if you're in the US, electricity, electrical items, telecommunication, those tend to be a bit pricier than the norm. Pretty much everything else tends to be cheaper. And of course, we've had people talk about the attractiveness from a fiscal and tax perspective of the country. If I may move on to basically giving you a little bit of a comparative study. It's not a study as much as a walk through the country from north to south. So the north of the country is cheaper generally in terms of its cost of living. It's very steeped in history and culture. It is colder and rainier. People think that Portugal is all sunshine. It's not. The reason why the north is green is because it rains more. It's as simple as that. And so it's a very beautiful green area, but the weather is perhaps not as appealing as when one comes further south. There is increasing rental regulation around Porto, and a typical, and I'm using the same example throughout the country, excluding the islands. It's not that I'm in any way discriminating. I just didn't have space on the slide. A two-bedroom property in the north, perhaps in Porto, 250,000, rentals from around 800 euros a month. The Silver Coast, it's traditionally, historically cheaper, again steeped in history. There has been a trend to build new or modern product. It is windy. It is one of the disadvantages of that coast. It is directly exposed to the Atlantic, and so the entire Portuguese coast has wind, but that is particularly windy when compared to the others. Traditional properties can start as low as around 75,000, with 750 euros being a reasonable amount of money to pay for a rent. A modern property equivalent two-bedroom, probably 220,000 across the main sort of cities on the Silver Coast is what you'll have to pay. Cascais and Estoril, which is the sort of the Côte d'Azur, if you will, of Portugal, the area where the kings and royalty in the past used to travel in Portugal. This is a very Cosmopolitan area, an existing expat community exists there. Expensive sales and rentals, especially as a result of the price increases of the last few years. 350,000 plus for a two-bedroom, 1,350 euros per month. Again, with the usual caveat, and I make Gavin's words my own. You know, I hold my hands up and say that there are probably many exceptions to this rule. You might find something a little bit cheaper, a lot of stuff a lot more expensive, but this is a guideline price to give you a sense of the comparison between areas. The Linha, as we call it, which is between Cascais and Lisbon, and has easy access to both. It's an urban type environment, less character in some instances. Prices are rising fast, but you can still get some more value for money. So if you like to be near Lisbon or Cascais or both, but don't want to pay their premiums, then 225,000 probably will get you into that market there, and 900 euros per month going upwards. Lisbon itself, some very good yields, although those are dropping due to property prices. It's very good for purchasing historical property, you know, that charming facade, you know, in a historical traditional area. It's good for that. Quick movers. So please don't ask us or anyone else to send you a list today of what's available, and then if your decision is in 6 months' time, it'll be completely and utterly different a market. We had a Chinese client calling us yesterday. He'd been in touch 3 months ago, and we did fall into the trap of, you know, sending him a list, and every single thing on that list had been sold. So we were quite strict about, you know, setting timeframes within which we sort of communicate property information, because we need to understand the markets. There is, I've always said this, the risk of overheating in Lisbon due to the dramatic price increases in the city, although that's tempered now a little bit by the COVID influence. There is a strict rental regulation, as we've talked about, 300,000 euros plus to get into the market. I would say realistically, probably a bit more than that, 1,500 per month for a two-bed. Refurbishment, 225,000 for something that needs some fairly substantial refurbishment. And then the Algarve, which is the top tourist destination. It has the highest number of real estate inquiries, and I think the statistics that Nigel showed reinforce that it's still the number one destination in terms of inquiries. It has more sunny days than California. It has a large multinational expat community, as I've said, multilingual as well. So English is not difficult. It's not difficult to find people who speak English, locals or others. It's also a very good market for what I call a combination type existence. If you're buying and you want to rent out in the summer and use the property in the winter, or if you want to optimize the yields by renting by the week in the summer and by the month in the winter, this is a market that allows you to do that more so than excuse me, than a few of the other markets around the country. 175,000 realistically will get you into the market with a two-bed, 900 euros per month. Rouen starts at 75,000 and upwards. And the alert at the bottom, I think, is important. Please don't expect premium locations, you know, at a sort of countryside price, because those days, I think, are long gone. A little bit about the Algarve, because it is the one that that the majority of people ask about, or a big percentage of people ask about. Voted best place in the world to retire for 8 years in a row. Some of the best beaches, golf courses, marinas, so blue flags, award-winning, and so on. English is not an issue. It's as often a question that it arises about whether people will be able to integrate. Yes, you will if English is one of your languages. We've had people from other non-English speaking countries able to integrate very well, and that's because there are also associations of different foreign communities, if that's something that you wish to participate in, and they would meet periodically, and that would allow you to speak to someone in Swedish and French and so on, as well as Portuguese or English. The food and wine among the best and the freshest in the world. We are the largest fish consumer in Europe, and I think the second largest in the world after the Japanese. The real estate, although it's increased in price, it's still very attractive. And the Algarve generally is less developed than Spain, although I should caveat that because Spain is such a massive market that if you're in the northern Costa Blanca, between Javier and Moreira, for example, you may well have a low density area, and if you're in Portimão and the Algarve, it's a high density area. So again, it's a generalization, but in the main, areas that people understand and are accustomed to dealing with tend to be less developed in Portugal than in Spain. Many activities. It's also been historically quite a private place. The Portuguese are quite reserved as a nation, and there's a quite high respect for privacy. So in particular in COVID times or semi-post Corona virus first wave times, this is something that a lot of people are seeking. So moving on, in terms of the decisions that many people are having to make, some of those involve whether or not they wish to rent versus buy. And we've done a little table here as to, what you should be, depending on the situation you're in, the sorts of things that you might be considering. So if you're not sure whether this is your destination and you want to trial something, then clearly you should have an element of rental in your solution. If you love this, you've been going to the country for 10 years, 12 years or whatever, and it's been your dream to settle, then clearly you're more a candidate to purchase a property for all sorts of different reasons. If you're thinking of investing and building a revenue generating portfolio, which is still possible, you need to look around, but it's possible, then really you should be buying. If it's a part of your residence, clearly you should be renting. But if you're looking to split your time, and we have clients, for example, that split some time between Colombia, Portugal, the US, they've bought a property, they rent it out when they're not there, and they occupy it themselves when they are. And these are both residents and non-residents. So the purchase is a good solution when you've got a hybrid situation or scenario where you want to use the property yourself, but actually want to use the revenue to actually cover your cost and sometimes to even fund those periods of your own stay, especially if you're intending to stay in the winter and then rent out in the summer. If you sort of love a property but you need some time to sell back home, so you'd like to buy something, clearly we have people who are building houses and need to rent first, or who think they need time to look around and so rent first before buying. And I can certainly answer some questions about ideal rental times if you're certain you are going to buy, but that's a different question. Flexibility and reduced capital investment, so they have a limited pension and want to have a fallback plan in terms of holding on to the capital. Clearly, then a rental solution would be better because you're preserving the capital. We have someone else who's moving, UK residents moving from Dubai. They don't have any heirs, and they've said, well, we don't mind using up our capital because we're not leaving this to anyone. So those sort of personal situations may also affect the sort of solution that you adopt. Clearly, the residency and any tax statuses that you might wish to apply for will affect your ability to do so. And here I should make the point that the NHR status does not require a purchase. You can apply for the NHR status by proving your residency either via a suitable rental contract, or by showing and proving that you have paid the tax and have the deeds. Sometimes don't even have the deeds, but you paid your tax on the purchase of a property. So rental or purchase will qualify you as long as it's the correctly drafted documents. They will qualify you for the NHR status as long as you meet, of course, all the other criteria of the status itself. If you're worried about needing care in the future, and if you think you may need to move homes, so for example, you think your idyllic situation is, countryside villa over 2 floors plus a basement area, miles away from anyone because you're protected from COVID, but actually you're 76 years old, and at 78 you might need care, and perhaps that countryside villa might not look as attractive as it at 78 as it did at 76, for example. And clearly, if you want an age-specific solution, there are options which are both rental and purchasing based. and then I think you can go back and see this video. A couple of the websites we run will give you a lot more information on that. So just a snapshot of one of the websites we run called algarvelonglets.com, and I've kind of divided a rather busy screen. On the left, you can see the sort of results you get if you put in, I don't know what the search was, so sort of in the Lagos area, an apartment, and you want something that's available for monthly winter lets, you can then see the price range there. I think I put in 2 bedrooms, I did, and that was between sort of 990 a month, and then there's some that go up to 1,450 a month. So it depends on what you look for. And then another search, which was villa on an annual let, and then we came up with the results showed a series of properties, the lowest of which on this screen, and maybe lower, I didn't sort it by price, was 1,350 per month. And the highest was around 2,300 on this particular screen. So you can see there is a price range depending on the type of and style of property that is on offer. I want to touch briefly on the Golden Visa as a post-Brexit solution. So some people, I can't remember the statistics exactly that Nigel pointed out to us beforehand, but I think it was around 40-something% were thinking of making a move, whether rental or purchase, in this year, 2020, which means that there's 56% who are not. At some point in the future, they will. And then the Golden Visa itself may be a solution for people. So on the assumption that the UK will become a third nation external to the EU, and residency rights will have to be applied for on the same basis as anyone else outside the EU, then the Golden Visa is one of these options, and that's a purchase option as opposed to a non-purchase option such as the D7 retirement visa, which I'm not sure if it was spoken about or not, but there are 4 Golden Visa categories in Portugal. They range from 280,000 to 500,000 or above, but these are the limits of compulsory investment that one has to make to qualify, and they essentially depend on location. The interesting thing about this, just briefly, is most Golden Visa buyers, and remember that a large majority are Chinese, followed by Brazilians, South Africans, Russians, Turkish, and a few others. But the Golden Visa buyers typically want to be in big cities, but they also then look for a few other criteria. So I think in the future, British people who go down the Golden Visa route will actually change the profile of the Golden Visa applicant, because British people are not necessarily interested in always being in the big cities. They may, for example, be quite happy to consider a lower cost inland Golden Visa, such as 280,000, or do a sort of coastal, low density municipality Golden Visa, which would be 400,000. So I think British people going forward, we will see if Brits use the Golden Visa as a solution, we will see those other categories coming into their own. And just as an example, for not only for British people going forward, but anyone else who may be on this call and who is not an EU citizen at the moment, this is an example of a low density coastal Golden Visa property. And you can see that for the same value of the 3-bedroom sort of golf course villa, you would get maybe an apartment, a 2-bedroom apartment in Lisbon, and which wouldn't qualify for a Golden Visa because it would probably need to be at the 500,000 level, whereas this does because of the low density. So I think the analysis of the Golden Visa going forward, and even for those non-EU citizens currently considering it, is very important. Okay. The other thing that's important is drilling down into your criteria, because it's no use saying, oh, I'd like a 2-bedroom apartment with a pleasant view. You know, this could result in multiple outcomes depending on your other criteria. And I've attempted to show this on this slide. So if you added any of these, so for example, a condo with on-site amenities, that will give you a certain option. If you say, well, I want it to be under 200,000, the option will be totally different because the condo with the amenities would be above 200,000, and so on and so forth. And I think the point I want to make with this is that it's a point that I think was made by someone, I can't remember exactly who it was. I think Edwina made the point that increasingly we are seeing agencies work on the basis of representing buyers. And we, as a business, have been doing this for at least the last 6 or 7 years. When all the other agencies thought, oh, why are you representing the buyer? You always get paid by the seller, was the obvious answer. We thought, well, because we don't know what the buyer initially wants. We've got to be prepared to listen in order to adapt the search or the conversations we have with other real estate partners and companies to the requirements of the and I say buyer, it could be tenant or renter. So the client will dictate the process. And the difficulty is sometimes in the traditional model of speaking to 20 real estate agencies and so on, is that it's very difficult to wade through this morass of communication, websites, information, and so on and so forth. So just as you should be attempting to concentrate fiscal advice, legal advice, we highly recommend, not just because we do this, but we also work in other ways, but if you can, try to concentrate your search with a preferred partner that you sense understands you and can help you work through the whole selection process, whether it be rental or sales. And importantly, what you will find is if you are a rent before buy candidate, try to work with someone who can work with you through the entire process. Because if you think, oh, I'm going to find a house to buy myself, the first, you talk to agencies and then they will say, well, when are you ready to buy? Oh, in a year's time. Well, they'll switch off because there's no immediate business. So you're then going to find someone else and say, well, can I rent from you? Well, I don't really have many rentals and so on. And when you do, you say, well, can you help me to buy something? Well, I don't really work with the buying process. So try to simplify your interfaces in any new country by working with an organization that maybe does both. And the reason we say this is to avoid the sort of process that often goes on, especially if you are limited in terms of time. And the 31st of December, again, for those UK citizens, is fast approaching. Travel is not so easy. And so if you start off with a Google 2-bedroom apartments with sea view in town X, you'll come up with a list of properties and agents. You start to plan the visit, which, by the way, many people won't be able to do because they can't fly back. There's a quarantine, blah, blah, blah. So you get confused. You ask the same agents twice. The busy agents will quit. They won't even bother because people are quite busy anyway. Just before the visit, you'll find that some properties are not available. Then you go with the second agent. They might show you the same property. You then want to rent out. The agent doesn't do rental management. And you get a sense of the sort of process that might occur. So we had the same thing on the Spain call when I was listening in. Many of the agencies in Spain were proposing the same thing as we are in Portugal, which is really try to concentrate, if you can at all, the search of your process with a preferred partner, reliable, somebody you can trust, a company you can trust, so that you have that continuity and that simplicity. The other thing we often get asked about, and this applies also to Nigel's event. So Expat World was going to run a physical event, but of course it's impossible to predict what the quarantine and the travel arrangements will be like, and therefore that event is in abeyance, it's sort of on hold. But it does not mean that we cannot continue to attend clients on the ground. So we continue to have our very popular discovery tours, which is a sort of combination of tourism and real estate. And these are excellent for those people who know a region more or less, but not quite sure exactly where. They want to compare the options in different towns, see different options while they are there in a very sharp, concentrated fashion. They tend to be sort of 1 to 2 days, depending on the extent of the criteria and the options available. And importantly, in COVID times, what we have done is we now use purposely, we rent larger vehicles so that we can still maintain social distancing while not losing the benefit of having one of our expert team members in the same car as the client. So in the past, clients traveled with our team, and they were obviously exchanging ideas, questions, and answers. But in the future, that will continue. Not in the future, we're doing it already. That continues, but in much larger vehicles. So people now sit to the back with a minimum two sort of meter distance, with masks on, and so on. So it's sort of COVID-proofed, as it were, as much as is possible. And then finally, I'm sorry, I normally watch my time on my phone, so I hope I haven't gone over too much. There's an email contact for our firm. If you want to find out a little bit about different points, so retirement living generally, then the best site for referral is the Algarve Senior Living site. If the property finder or buyer agent model is something that struck your interest, then there is a site specifically on that, propertyfinderportugal.com. If you want annual and winter lets, an example will be algarvelonglets.com, and then a couple of our social media. And sorry, my messages keep coming up here. So those are the contacts for clients located in each region. You can call a sort of local number, and that will get through to us. And that is that. Thanks very much, Nigel, and thank you all for listening.
Well, many thanks, Lewis. We should at this stage have seen all about the property market and how you find a property and the most attractive areas and so on. But let's move on to the point where we've actually selected the property and sort of talk about what is the next step that people should be taking.
Well, both processes are interlinked anyway. I would most definitely suggest that anyone who's thinking of investing in Portugal try and contact and find a lawyer that's compatible with them, even whilst they are still searching for a property, because there can be benefits to having a lawyer in place already. Obviously, there's many questions that can be discussed prior to actually making an offer on the property. It also means that you already have a lawyer in place once you do find a property, which can obviously assist in terms of timeline, especially when you've located a property that is in a popular area at a very attractive price, and there could be other buyers. This said, once you do find a property, you know, and you have engaged a lawyer, the next step really is to put the agent and the lawyer in touch so that there can be a sharing of property documents and information on the property, so that the lawyer can start progressing with the conveyancing process. I think it's also important at this stage, once you have found the property, to decide whether this is going to be your primary residence or whether you're going to use this property as a holiday home initially, because this will have an impact on purchase taxes.
Okay, so people are often suggested that they use the developer's lawyer or the lawyer recommended by an estate agent. So is it really necessary and important to use an independent lawyer, and what are the advantages?
I mean, absolutely. It's important to have an independent lawyer because you want something who's looking out for your interests and is going to be impartial in all situations. This said, there are many agents that recommend lawyers, not because the lawyers work for the agents per se, but because they've worked in the past for other clients, and the agents have found the lawyers to be proactive, to know what they're doing. Obviously, you do want someone that's going to be looking out for your interests. So it is important to find a lawyer yourself, and also to ensure that that lawyer is compatible with you and that you feel comfortable and have trust in that lawyer.
And we here talk about power of attorney. Do you normally suggest that people issue a power of attorney, and what are the advantages?
This is actually one of the first questions that I tend to ask clients. It's whether they're going to be able to travel or be in Portugal to sign a potential promissory contract or even a final deed. Because if they are not able to travel or not going to be here for whatever reason, or feel that they may not be able to be here, then a power of attorney is definitely the way forward. This is a document that enables the buyer to give the lawyer powers to represent that buyer during the process of a purchase. Okay, it's a legal document that is signed either before a notary or before another lawyer for it to become valid. These documents here in Portugal do not have validity dates, and one of the questions that I do get asked quite commonly is, can I as a lawyer with a power of attorney act without the client's consent? The answer is yes, but I would obviously never do that because I would not want to risk my practicing license. And secondly, I would not go and buy a property for a client without the client giving me the authority and the money to do so, of course. Power of attorney is very helpful, especially, you know, in certain situations such as representing you at the tax office to obtain a fiscal number, which is necessary for a purchase in Portugal, to represent you at the end of the process by changing the contracts for the utilities, so for the electricity, the gas, the water. There are a number of things in which the power of attorney is helpful, even if you did choose to come and sign a final deed or promissory contract yourself.
Okay, thanks, Serena. So what does the conveyancing process involve in Portugal, and how does it differ from the sort of process people might be more used to in the UK?
Okay, so in Portugal, the conveyancing process will involve initially receiving the property documents for the property to do all of the necessary checks. These checks will involve checking whether there are any charges on the properties, whether there are any debts, illegalities, whether the documents harmonize in terms of area, in terms of who the owners are. Most of the documents here in Portugal are actually electronic, and they have a validity date of circa 6 months. So I would always want to see updated documents for the property. Upon analysing the documents and establishing that everything is in order to move forward, we would then, in most cases, move towards a promissory contract. This is a contract whereby the purchaser is promising to buy the property and the seller is promising to sell the property. It's a binding contract, and obviously if any of the parties were to back out of this contract, there would be penalties. Okay, moving forward from the promissory contract, in fact, during the negotiations for the promissory contract, there can be some conditions that need to be fulfilled for a final deed to take place. Sometimes you could have a situation where the parties have agreed that the building is in need of painting in a certain section, or that some construction needs to be done beforehand. There are several instances that could appear and that could be conditions in the contract. Moving on from the contract, you would be working towards a final deed. That final deed will take place before a notary, which is a third independent party who would receive all the documents and all of the information from both buyer, seller, methods of payments, property documents, and would actually formalise the act of the purchase and sale. In the UK, I understand that the conveyancing process can be slightly different. I do not personally have experience with the process in the UK, so I wouldn't be able to point out any differences.
Okay. And so what issues do you tend to come across when you carry out the searches in Portugal? Are there particular issues that commonly arise?
Yeah, the most common issues that I've come across are sometimes issues with the areas. Sometimes you have a registered area in the tax office and a different registered area in the land registry. This can be caused due to a number of situations and can in most cases be resolved. Sometimes there are charges registered to the property at the land registry. These could be, for example, because someone has not been making payments for their council tax and therefore the tax office has registered a charge. Again, this can be resolved, it can be removed. You do on occasion find some illegalities in properties. This is why it's really important to have a lawyer check obviously the documents and go through everything with the buyer. You know, I've had situations where sometimes a pool isn't legal, or there's been a change to the facade of the property which actually should be subject to planning and hasn't. So there are a lot of issues that could come up. It doesn't necessarily mean that they will come up in every single purchase and sale, but they could, and it is important to make sure that we're checking all of this before purchase goes ahead.
Okay. And what about surveys? Is it normal practice to have a survey carried out in Portugal? Would you recommend that people carry out a survey?
It wasn't normal practice, although I have seen an increase in the request of surveys in recent years. Really, it depends on the type of property that you're purchasing and whether you've caught up on any issues during a visit to the property. You know, it depends really on the individual circumstances. I mean, one thing that we do get, especially in the Algarve, with some properties, is sometimes some issues with damp, which are quite common because of the properties being so close to the coast. There are treatments that can be done to address that issue. One thing that the survey can help is when clients aren't able to come here in person. They may have visited the property, gone back to their home country, and obviously in the meantime documents have been exchanged. I, as a lawyer, would have received plans. It could be helpful to have a survey to make sure that those plans that are registered and deposited with the City Hall actually reflect the physical reality of the property. So if there is the opportunity to have a survey done, then yes, I would recommend to have one. This said, sometimes some purchases can be time sensitive. Surveys can take some time to take place and for the reports to become available. And until such time as a promissory contract is signed, that property is open to be sold to someone else. And this is something that needs to be borne in mind also.
Okay, thank you. So looking at the costs, so other than the purchase price, what should people allow for? Are there agency fees? Who pays? Does the buyer or the seller pay them? What are the other fees that need to be paid? And are there any taxes or stamp duty to pay?
Okay, so in terms of agency fees, these are usually paid by the seller. The seller is the one who will have a contract with the agent in most cases, although it has slowly started to become the case where you can, as a buyer, have a contract with an agent for them to be your sole agent to assist you in locating a property. So there could potentially be fees payable by the buyer as well, depending on your personal situation. In addition to the agency fees, you could also have, you will also have, sorry, purchase taxes, which are the transfer tax and stamp duty. Now, the stamp duty is usually a flat rate of 0.8% of the declared purchase figure. Okay, the transfer tax, however, is on a sliding scale and will really depend on whether you're declaring this property as your primary residence or as a holiday home. There could also be variables when you have, for example, a mixed property. In Portugal, sometimes you can purchase a property that has an urban element, which would be the section of the property that would have the house itself, and you could have a rustic element, which would be taxed at a different rate to the urban element. You could also have a situation, for example, in which you're buying an apartment and a garage, but the garage is deemed to be an independent property to the apartment itself, and therefore those again would be taxed at different rates. All in all, I would expect purchasers to take into account roughly 8% of the purchase value. For more individual estimate of costs, I would urge them to get in touch with their lawyer to get a breakdown according to the property that they've chosen.
Okay, we've had a query from one of the audience about a deposit they've been asked for before the seller will take the property off the market. Is this normal practice? What's its status? And is there anything they need to be aware of?
Okay, so some agents have this policy whereby they will take what is known commonly as a reservation fee for a property. So imagine a buyer's gone to see a property, they are really interested in this property. The agent will suggest to the buyer to pay a reservation fee and sign a reservation agreement so that that property is removed from the market until such time as a promissory contract can be signed. Legally, this is possible. There are legal provisions to allow an agent to receive this reservation fee and hold it in a client account for that purpose. In terms of the reservation agreement itself, I would always recommend that clients get in touch with the lawyer to make sure that obviously the conditions within the reservation agreement are favourable and that they understand everything that's contained within. I've come across, for example, some situations where this reservation fee is non-refundable, and for example, the client has paid a reservation fee, the property documents have only been made available after the payment of the reservation fee. It turns out that the property had issues, and actually the reservation agreement says that that reservation is non-refundable, which makes it quite difficult because you then either purchase within the same agent a different property to not lose those funds, or you run the risk of losing them. So really, I would make sure that that agreement is checked before signed. But it is something that has become quite common. The only other thing that I would like to mention in regards to these reservation fees are that they do not bind the seller to sell the property to you as a buyer. The seller will take the property off the market, but he is still able legally to accept other offers if he wants to.
Okay. So another query here was somebody has been asked to underdeclare the purchase price. Is that sort of common practice, and what would be your advice?
Okay, I would not advise to underdeclare the purchase price, although there is a common practice to attribute some of the value towards contents if a property is being sold with contents. Okay, you may make a small saving by underdeclaring the purchase price in terms of transfer tax and stamp duty, but actually you need to be thinking about what happens when you sell the property. Now, if this is your secondary habitation or a holiday home, you will be paying capital gains on any profit you make on the property, and the rate at which you're charged on that profit is going to be far higher than the saving that you would make by underdeclaring slightly the purchase value. With a primary habitation, depending on what your intentions would be for the future in terms of reinvestment, you could or not pay capital gains. But again, the rate would be much higher than the saving that you would make by underdeclaring. Again, if the property is being bought with contents, then yes, by all means, the parties can agree to attribute a small portion of that purchase price towards those contents. But if not, I would declare the full purchase price.
Okay, thanks. So as it's approached to the completion, what preparation is undertaken for that, and how does the notary sort of fit in
Okay, well, obviously we would go through the initial stage, which would lead us again to this promissory contract, which is the contract that binds the parties to sell and purchase the property. At that stage, there would have been potentially some negotiations and some conditions to be fulfilled until final deed. So we would want to ensure that between promissory contract and a final deed that those conditions have been fulfilled. We would want to make the booking with the notary. We would want to send all of that documentation through to the notary, you know, to be able to appear at the appointment on the day that's been set. You would want to ensure, if you hadn't done so before, that you have your Portuguese fiscal number by this stage, that you have transferred the funds to Portugal for the remainder of the purchase price. To ensure that you're either able to travel to Portugal or that you have given your lawyer power of attorney, whether on your initial visit to Portugal, whether that power of attorney is dealt with in your country of origin, which is also possible. And essentially everything gets sent to the notary, and you would then appear at the notary, or your lawyer would appear on your behalf to formalize the act of the purchase and sale.
Okay, and so on the day of completion, what's the process there? What happens on the final day?
Okay, so on the day of completion, everyone would attend at the notary. The notary would have prepared the deed ahead of that appointment. The deed would be read out in Portuguese, okay, before everyone who is present. If the purchasers were to be there in person and did not understand the Portuguese language, I, as their lawyer, or any other person who is representing them, could do a translation into the English language. However, the document would be signed in Portuguese because we are in Portugal and the document needs to be formalized in the Portuguese language. Once the document is signed, you are, for all purposes, the legal owner of the property. The final deed itself, the original document, gets archived with the notary, and you would receive, as the buyer, a certified copy. This means that if you were to lose the document, the certified copy, or if it were to get destroyed, or if anything were to happen, you could always obtain a new copy of this document. And then following the final deed, there would be a request for a registration at the land registry for that property to be transferred into the buyer's names.
Okay. And is there anything else you would sort of recommend around completion, or is that covered?
One thing that I usually ask questions following completion is, you know, if they're not here, who would they want me to hand the keys over? Do they have someone that manages the property for them? Would they want me to hold the keys in the meantime? The other thing that comes up quite often is the changeover of the utility contracts. I get questioned quite a lot on this topic because obviously, how do we establish who's meant to pay what in terms of the bills? What happens on the day of the final deed is that usually the agent would take meter readings for the utilities, for the electricity, the water, the gas, and would provide those to the lawyer, so that when the lawyer gets those contracts changed over, she can provide that reading to the companies, so that the seller is charged up until that reading and the buyer is charged from that reading onwards. Other things that some buyers may want to consider post completion is whether they are, again, if this is going to be a holiday home, whether they want to use that holiday home for short lets. Also in regards to whether it would be feasible for them, whether they want to start making plans to have a Portuguese will to cover their Portuguese assets. These are all things that can be discussed post, obviously, final deed.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Edwina. Very clear and helpful.